Today, I am going to be benchmarking the Zotac Synergy Edition of the Nvidia GeForce GT 630. Now, I think I need to mention, there are several versions of the GT 630, and I don't fully understand it. And Nvidia goes by something called architecture names, and there is a Kepler version and a Fermi version. What's the difference? I don't really know. I know some have 192 shader cores and mine has 96. And mine has 1GB of VRAM and other ones have 2GB of VRAM. So it is a pretty slow version of the GT 630. And I decided to get a good middle ground between the highest end GT 630 and the lowest end GT 630. I will overclock my GT 630 as far as I can. I overclocked at 120 MHz on the core clock and 203 MHz on the memory core clock, to hopefully give it that extra boost to make it at least somewhat more comparable to the faster version. I should also mention I am pairing this with a Intel Pentium G7400, which should not bottleneck the GT 630 in any case. I also have 32GB of DDR4 RAM running at 3200 MHz, and also a SSD for the boot drive and for the game drive. Starting off is Apex Legends. Now, Apex Legends runs really weird. So, it is extremely CPU optimized, but extremely not graphics card optimized. Sort of. So, you can run this game on pretty much any CPU, but not any graphics card is what I'm trying to say. Either way, the GT 630 ran the game at roughly 11 frames per second at native 720p on the low settings. Then I tried setting an adaptive frame rate to 60, and the adaptive frame rate to 60 goes over and lowers the resolution of the game, and then makes it bigger, sort of, to make the game look like it's 720p, but it's actually being rendered at a lower resolution, like for example 240p. Either way, that didn't help all that much, and it was still getting around 18 frames per second on average. I also need to add, I cannot test any resolution lower than 720p on Apex Legends because the game does not support any lower resolution than 720p. BeamNG Drive at 1080p on the lowest preset was running at approximately 13 to 14 frames per second on average, which is utterly horrible. It is barely playable, you could probably get used to it in this game, but all in all, I really don't recommend this experience. At 720p, the game was getting roughly 28 frames per second on average, so it is definitely better, though the game did actually dip into the low 20s in the frame rate at times. That is around the heavily vegetated areas, like in the forest of the map called West Coast USA. So, not horrible, not great either, but at this point I definitely would say it is playable, just not ideal. And at 800 by 600, the game got roughly 35 frames per second on average. It did drop occasionally from 30 frames per second, but it was definitely more smooth than 720p. Though I do need to add, I did end up resetting the overclock on 800 by 600 due to the game crashed. Though if I were to test it again, I'm sure it wouldn't crash, but I think the crash might be due to a slight instability. I'm not sure though, because the crash is somewhat random. But if it was overclocked, it would get probably around 37 to 40 frames per second on average. But if I were to be using this graphics card playing this game, I would stick to 720p because it's a pretty decent balance between at least somewhat decent visuals and also the game's not a complete slideshow. Brawlhalla runs on pretty much anything, and this is no exception. Brawlhalla runs just fine on this at 1080p. I can't tell what frame rate it's getting though because the game doesn't allow MSI Afterburner's overlay to work due to some sort of anti-cheat, and also the game is actually capped to 60 frames per second anyway, so most likely the game is getting 60 frames per second and is just locked there. But one way or another, the game was completely playable, and yeah, there's nothing wrong with how it performed. I should also add, Brawlhalla does not have any graphical settings besides the resolution. Call of Duty Warzone 2.0 did not launch. I pressed the play button, it goes over and shows the blue stop button, which is usually a good sign that the game's going to launch. then it proceeds to just show the play button again like it immediately crashed. So, all in all, it is completely unplayable. I am actually somewhat surprised that it didn't launch on here, because it did launch on my GTX 750 Ti, although it crashed almost immediately. But to be fair, the GTX 630 is definitely older than the GTX 750 Ti. CSGO at the very low settings at 720p ran at roughly, I can't tell you the average frame rate, because the average frame rate was really messed up. The reason why is I died 57 times! Yes, 57 times in one round. How? I don't know. I was very bad at the game that day. And what happens when you die? Well, the frame rate goes up into the 100s, which is not accurate. The game was actually getting around 50 to 60 frames per second when I was alive, but I wasn't really alive more than like 5 seconds at a time because I died 57 times in a span of 10 minutes. Yeah, this is just, like, shockingly bad. I'm kind of just, like, impressed in myself at this point. Like, this is an impressive amount of deaths in 10 minutes. Is this, like, breaking a record or something? Alright, but one way or another, 1080p wasn't very playable, but 720p was, but I couldn't play the game anyway, so it doesn't matter. Though I should probably add, the CPU usage is actually higher than I was expecting. I was expecting it to be around 20%, but it's still not bottlenecking the GTX 16... Wait, what? No, it's still not bottlenecking the GT 630. I just thought that was pretty interesting. But yeah, the CPU can handle 100 plus frames per second in this game. Dota 2 at 1080p on the low settings, or the best performance settings, ran at roughly 100 frames per second on average, which far exceeded my expectations. I was expecting this game to run at roughly 40 frames per second, not 100. That is actually very amazing, and far exceeded my expectations. So, good job, Dota 2, you're very, very well optimized. GTA 5 at 720p on the normal preset, or technically that's the low settings, ran at roughly 60 frames per second on average. In some spots it did drop into the 40s in the frame rate, but all in all I'd say 720p on the low settings is perfectly playable, and that's the resolution I would target. I did also try 800 by 600 off camera, and it did perform a little bit better, but it did look significantly worse. So, at least for me, 720p would be, again, the best option. Halo Infinite didn't really work, so I pressed the play button, then it goes over and shows the blue stop logo, which is a good sign. Then it goes over and gives me an error saying my graphics card isn't supported, then I press OK, then it goes back to saying play again. So yeah, the game just basically automatically crashes, and it is completely unplayable. You can't even get into the full game, just getting an error message is all you can do. Lost Light at, I'm presuming is the medium settings, it's the refined preset. Well, there's only 3 graphical settings. And it's set to refined, which is in the middle. So I'm assuming it's the medium settings. Either way, the game was running perfectly fine, and I was getting about 100 frames per second on average, so all in all, there's nothing to complain about in the absolute slightest, and this is probably one of the best performing games so far on this list. Minecraft Bedrock Edition at 1080p on the medium settings, I'd say. I mean, everything was on high, but fancy graphics was on low, or off, I guess I should say, and it was on 12 chunks render distance. Either way, the game was running pretty good, not ideal, there was a little bit of input lag, but the game was getting around 55 frames per second on average, which is perfectly playable. And I also decided to try Minecraft Java Edition with the Iris and Sodium mod, and it was getting roughly 80 frames per second on average with roughly the same settings, 8 chunks render distance and everything. Is like a mix of medium and low, or on and off I guess I should say, but all in all it's basically medium, and I'd say 80 frames per second is actually pretty decent to be fair. It's not great, especially because we don't have shaders on yet, but all in all, it is pretty decent. I also tried playing the game with the complementary shaders, and yeah, that didn't go very well. That went rather poorly. It was getting roughly 10 frames per second on average, and Yeah, don't even bother trying to play with shaders. Yes, the shaders were on the high settings, but at the same time, even if they were on the low settings, it would only be getting around 15 frames per second in this case. So, it's not a very good idea on a GT 630 to play Minecraft with shaders. New World is the most unoptimized game I can think of, and on 1024 by 768p, or is it P? I don't know. At 1024 by 768 resolution on the low settings, it was getting roughly 8 frames per second. I also tried enabling dynamic resolution scaling. It's not like FSR. I mean, it is like FSR, but it's not called FSR. But one way or another, that did actually get the frame rate up to roughly 11. So it is a marginal improvement, not by much, but it does improve the frame rate slightly. But this is a really bad experience, like really not good at all. I mean, you might be able to get away with it, but I'd have a hard time playing this game with this frame rate, to be fair. Like, a really hard time. And Roblox Arsenal at 1080p on the low settings was running perfectly fine. Like, absolutely fine. I mean, I guess it wasn't exactly perfect, but one way or another, it was getting 100 plus frames per second on average, and I cannot complain at all. I was expecting this game to run significantly slower than it actually is, so yeah, the GT 630 is surprising me by a significant amount here. I am pretty impressed. And for 3D Mark Firestrike, it got a score of 929 and says it's legendary, whatever that means. And while this footage of GTA 5 at 800 by 600 plays in the background, I want to say I do not recommend getting the Nvidia GT 630 in 2023. The reason why is on used websites, for example eBay, and I type it into eBay and search for the lowest price first. The cheapest GT 630 I can find is $20. Yes, that is cheap, but if you go over and get a graphics card like a Nvidia Quadro 600, which is, well, half the price, $10, you're going to get identical performance, or roughly identical performance. So it is far better going for the Nvidia Quadro 600 than the GT 630. But there's also another thing. If you're willing to spend $17 instead of $20, you could go over and get yourself a AMD Radeon R5 430, and it has 2GB of VRAM, which is double the amount of the GT 630 and Quadro 600, and it has 384 shader cores, not 96, so it is significantly faster. I actually made a video on it. But yeah, I don't recommend getting this graphics card. Look elsewhere for something cheap. Either way, thank you so much for watching, and have a nice day.